To think that there's surfboards in one room and Bibles in another, it's like my dream of, when I was a teenager. So today I'm actually going to talk rather specifically about a particular problem that the people pose for people who are trying to keep charge of their Bibles. And the only thing I want to say, because this is it looks to me like, although you're very grown up looking, I suspect that you're students. I want you to remember two things before I get started, okay? One is that throughout this talk, as opposed to ranging widely, as I did in my book, I'm going to be talking about the period that I know best, and that is going to be exclusively around 1558 to the 1630s. I'll digress a little bit. I'll always tell you when I do. But I am a Reformation scholar, and I'll be talking about the English Reformation today. And no matter what I tell you today, especially sort of towards the second half of this talk, I am talking about a Protestant church. Okay, don't want you to think I'm talking about a different kind, because you might be fooled. Because when I was working on this, in conjunction with working on the exhibit in the book, this is probably one of the most surprising, counterintuitive things that I found in all of my research. So let me begin. The Bible alone, the decidedly unorthodox Reverend William Chillingworth wrote in 1637, is the religion of Protestants. Whether it was also the religion of England's Protestant church is a question that drives this talk. It is a question rarely asked and may in fact seem counterintuitive or simply rude. This is not for lack of books on this general subject of the Bible or that church. A number of recent books, shrewdly timed to take advantage of the 400th anniversary of the so-called King James Bible, have focused our attention onto that enterprise of 1611 and the processes, political and scholarly, which allowed other early modern Bibles to be translated into English. We are now very well educated in the Bible's literary influence, receptions, and modes of translation. Bibliographic, print historical, and materialist studies of the 16th and 17th century Bible abound. Fueled by recent ambitious text editing projects, Scripture as filtered through the medium of early modern preaching has been a subject of intense scholarly interest since the 1990s, often financed by the British government. I am a beneficiary of that interest. We who work on early modern English religion, in fact, do almost nothing but investigate the social consequences and cultural impact of the word on worship and doctrine, on education, rhetoric, poetry, and politics, on post-Reformation England's nascent Protestantism and its lingering or malingering Catholicism. We rarely take, however, a simple look at the post-Reformation Church of England's formally articulated attitudes towards the Christian Bible. And that's a pity, as there is almost nothing more formal nor more articulate than a state church, and the Church of England was no exception to this commonplace of the history of Christianity textbooks. So my lecture today will track the English Church's official position on Scripture as articulated in the reigns of Elizabeth Tudor, 1558 to 1603, James Stuart, 1603 to 1625, and very briefly Charles Stuart, who succeeded his father James I and was executed by his parliament after 7 years of civil war conducted largely for reasons of religion in 1649. So he was shorter when he died than when he was a king. I will argue that the Church of England's legislative statements about Scripture shifted markedly in both tone and content between the Protestant settlement of 1558-9 and the Revolutionary Long Parliament of 1640, revealing, I will argue, an official church increasingly intent upon downplaying or even countering their reliance on sola scripturalism, which just means the Bible alone, that had animated its recent Reformation. This is the important, neglected, and counterintuitive background to the printing of the King James Bible. And this, in the end, is also the story of a process that created subjects so alarmed by a perceived decline in that Reformation's principles and policies that they became politically radicalized, and some of them took their KJVs and brought them to the New World. Now, my claim is based on a single and singular source, the acts and injunctions promulgated by a legislatively founded, legislatively authorized, and legislatively run church, increasingly intent between the 1560s and 1630s to keep its local parish churches under effective control by means of episcopal visitation and oversight. Diocesan and parish visitation was the linchpin of effective government in England's episcopal polity and government by bishops, a national governmental structure that did not change with the Reformation, but which did, arguably, make the changes demanded by Reformation easier to implement and oversee. Here, the long arm of church law reached all the way into parish pews, altars, and churchyards, and on a regular basis. In England, all new bishops were required to visit their jurisdiction within 18 months of translation or elevation by the monarch, who was, after the Reformation, their church's supreme head on earth. After that, they were supposed to visit their region every 3 years. And amazingly, many, if not most, did. Even archbishops, generally a rather lazy and luxurious lot in the Middle Ages, visited all the dioceses in their provinces as soon as possible after consecration, and then visited individual ones whenever a bishopric was vacated. But most important for my purposes, the questions these august individuals planned to ask about how each parish church was run, what it owned, and the spiritual condition and habits of its personnel and laity were pre-circulated to the local church wardens who were charged with providing the answers. By the beginning of the 17th century, these articles were routinely printed so church wardens could easily provision themselves with pre-test study guides, thereby bequeathing historians of the Church of England with a veritable treasure trove of illuminating evidence of the generalized values of the church, of the material cost of Reformation, of the degree to which any church, whether parish or cathedral, was willing to comply with them. It is clear these visits were significant. Visitation articles are some of the most heavily hand-annotated of any early modern printed page in the research library, proof of their having been read in the past, and carefully. This was for good reason. Church wardens had much to answer for in a perilously transitional age. The Reformation, after all, made itself first known at the parish level by changes in church fabric and the purchase of new books, the Bible among these. A still largely illiterate laity surely noticed the new books before they could spell out the words contained within them, or had figured out that the world of the church had been turned, if not quite upside down, then at least sideways and catty-cornered. With these pamphlets then, and I read a lot of them, we can trace a message from the top down that is fairly clean and straightforward. It's just the rules. And my talk is then about the language of official church policy, not on the manner or the efficacy of its enforcement, or on lay or clerical response to that policy. Now, this is not to claim that the official voice of rule and enforcement is the only voice that matters, at Pepperdine University or in history. By its very nature, of course, though, an all-encompassing, involuntary state church must allow for latitude, a kind of winking at minor or isolated infractions of regulation. This makes its status as a national church tenable. So the English people, the English clergy, and even the English episcopate never responded to the canons or the rules of the English church in a uniform way. Nonetheless, if we track the church's official voice across 3 reigns, we can discern a trajectory, an unmistakable narrative of change over time, which historians love, as the church's stated attitude towards its own English Bible moved from breathless promotion to increasing suspicion to an extraordinary set of disavowals. This trend, I will suggest, and what I'm going to talk about, led the more godly-minded of English laypeople increasingly to view their Bibles as personal rather than corporate scripts, a development that would eventually become the first characteristic aspect of the Bible's reception and dissemination into a denominational America guided by the First Amendment. I'll remind you how that begins. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging freedom of speech.